Today we have Dr. Annalise Mithout. So, Dr. Mithout, your book, which I will pronounce in English because the original title is French, The Heart and the Law, Disability in Japanese Society. In Japanese, 心と法律、日本社会における障害者の位置。So this book was published by Editions Harman in 2024. The book examines how individuals with disabilities have participated in social life as a population perceived as the other. The book covers a broad historical span from medieval Japanese society to the Aoi Shiba no Kai movement in the 1970s and up to present-day employment issues in Japan. Its English translation is set for publication in 2026. And then you've been giving many speeches on your book in Japan. So first, could you briefly introduce yourself, including your institutional affiliation and area of expertise?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. So my name is Annelise Mithout, and I'm an associate professor at Université Paris-Cité, so in Paris, in France. And I'm working in the Department of Japanese Studies. So my main field of research is Japanese studies, and I focus mostly on disability in Japanese society. And so I started my work on disability when I was a PhD student. So I conducted a research on education for children with disabilities, and especially for education for blind children. So I conducted fieldwork in different schools for the blind in Japan and also in France, because at that time I was doing a comparative study. And after that, I investigated other subjects related to disability in Japan, such as employment and activist movements. And so the book is the results of this research.
So in a nutshell, what inspired you to write this book?
So actually, I should start by saying that it's the book that I wrote and that was intended for students. So actually, in France, we don't have any other book related to disability in Japan. So I had to write things from a very broad perspective because the audience has no previous knowledge of the subject. So I had to write a book with quite a broad scope. And actually, it was also important for me to do that because I actually wrote the book that I would have loved to read when I started my PhD research. In a way, I wanted to introduce from a very broad perspective the situation of disabled people in Japan. And my field of research is sociology, but I feel that history is also very important to understand contemporary society. So I would say that my perspective is, in a way, historical sociology.
Right. So you discovered this niche area in France. So that's great. Now, what unique arguments does your book offer? So if you could share one or two key arguments that set your book apart from other works of a similar nature, that would be great.
I think I should start by explaining the title. So in French, we say le cœur et le droit. So le cœur is the heart. It was very important for me to mention this word, the heart, because one of the things that surprised me the most when I started doing research on the disability in Japan was the fact that you can see hearts everywhere. And also the vocabulary of love is very present. And that was very surprising for me because in France, when we think of disability, we don't necessarily associate it with love or hearts. But in Japan, the heart is very present, be it in visual communication, for example, by public authorities, for example, like the logo mark of especially the heart-built logo. The word heart in its name. So hearts are basically everywhere. And it did not seem to be surprising for Japanese people, but it was very surprising for me. So I wanted to investigate why is there such an emotional approach to disability in Japanese public policies. So I wanted to investigate also how disabled people in Japan react to this approach. And I think some people with disabilities, especially in the disability rights movement, are very critical of this approach. So I wanted to investigate all of that. And my not exactly conclusion, but my approach was based on the idea to investigate how this emotional approach is combined with human rights approaches. So the idea that maybe in a way, in past times, the emotional approach was the major approach to disability, but progressively it has been replaced by a discourse based on human rights. But still, the heart-based approach has not disappeared, and so they are in a way combined in contemporary society.
It's interesting that you said that you can see the heart everywhere in Japan. And you know this, right? So you've heard the heart mark in Japanese, right? So last year I fractured my ribs, so I wasn't able to carry anything heavy. So I was wearing this in Japan. I was in a sense at the mercy of people's helping me with my luggage and so forth. But the reaction I had depends on the person. Even official workers at the station, their attitudes vary from person to person because it depends on each person's heart. So sometimes that ambiguous framework is really hard to ascertain the sufficient assistance throughout the situation and context. So yeah, I just directly experienced that while I was in Japan last winter.
Exactly. I think that's what I wanted to show in the book. It's when something is related to compassion for another person, it's not exactly the same as when it's related to the law. And I think that
Mhm.
duty is the thing that people are meant to do by the law. So that's why I wanted to investigate this subject, because for me it was very surprising.
So, in the context of disability studies in general, what key issue or issues were you hoping to address through this book?
So I would say my perspective is historical sociology. So it was very important for me to investigate facts of contemporary society through a historical approach. And so that's why I wanted to investigate the situation of people with disabilities and also cultural views of disabilities, like in the past. So the book actually goes very far back in the past, because it starts with the Nara period, so it's ancient times. And I should say that I'm not a specialist of Nara period. So for the historical part, I've based my arguments mostly on works by Japanese historians. So in a way, the historical part is more like a literature review than my own research, because I'm not a historian. But anyway, I thought it was extremely important to conduct a historical investigation before discussing contemporary society, because I think that we consider as maybe obvious today were maybe not obvious in pastime society. Probably they have been introduced by someone as at a certain point in time. And actually, I think this perspective of historical sociology is very important for Japanese studies. At least in France, it's maybe the main approach of scholars in Japanese studies. Because when we study Japanese society, we we are maybe surrounded by discourses about Japanese culture and Japanese tradition. And it's very important for Japanese studies scholars to deconstruct this discourse of tradition and culture, and to investigate, maybe with a more factual approach, the evolution of Japanese society. The history sociology mix is very important for Japanese studies scholar, at least in France.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much for that. So, in your opinion, how does your book contribute to the field of Japanese disabilities?
I think I contributed modestly to Japanese disability studies, because I also conducted, apart from the historical investigation, which is not based on primary sources and on my own research. I also conducted fieldwork on 3 different fields. Actually, the book is made of 2 parts. So the first part is the historical part, and in the second part there are 3 case studies on different subjects regarding contemporary society. So the first subject is activist movements, the second is education, and the third is employment. So I think maybe for disability studies scholars in Japan, the most interesting part would probably be my own research and my own fieldwork in education and employment. And as for the education part, I was willing to understand the roots of a contemporary education system for children with disabilities. So also the education part is also based on some historical research. And I tried to show that education for children with disabilities has historically been really strongly associated with the issue of employment. So it was the idea that children with disabilities are considered not productive. They lack productivity. They won't be able to, they won't be useful for society when they become adults. And so the whole purpose of the education system for children with disabilities is to make those children useful for society. And I think it's also related to the idea of repressing begging, because begging was a very important part of daily life for people with disabilities in ancient times in Japan, until Meiji period and maybe until the early Showa period. So the development of education for children with disabilities was in a way intended to provide those children with skills and abilities to earn their own livelihood, and not to rely on begging to survive. So vocational training has always been a very important part of education for children with disabilities. And I think we can still see traces of this idea now in the current education system, because in a way the current education system is based on an early selection among all the children, an early selection of who will be able to attend mainstream school and who will be able to and who will be oriented toward a special education institution. So this early selection is very important, and so children will live very different lives depending on the school that they attend. So I thought it was very important to investigate both sides of the education system. And I think it's important to investigate mainstream schools as well as special education institutions, because in the current, I would say, stream of research, most attention is focused on inclusive education, because we think that inclusive education is, we tend to think that inclusive education is better for children. And so not so many people are looking at special education, but still special schools do exist. They have not disappeared because of the movement towards inclusive education. So I thought it was extremely important to investigate special schools as well, to have the broader picture of the life of and education of children with disabilities.
Thank you very much. Previously, you mentioned that your book draws a lot from previous studies. right? But you said the book includes 3 case studies, and one of them focuses on employment in Japan. In fact, you ran a questionnaire with about 15 people. So your book not only has the survey of Japanese disability history, but also actual present data that you conducted to collect, right?
Yes, and also in the field of education, I went to special schools and I also went to ordinary schools. So I conducted field work also in the field of education. But yeah, in the field of employment, actually the employment chapter is divided into 2 parts because, as you probably know, there are 2 very different types of employment for people with disabilities in Japan. So they can either work in a mainstream company or they can work in a sheltered environment. Even though some people can go from one to the other depending on their life circumstances, but still those are very different types of employment situations. So I thought it would be important to investigate both sides. So I conducted a field work on mainstream employment by interviewing, as you said, 15 people working in mainstream companies. And for that field work, actually, scope of my research was maybe a little bit narrow because I really wanted to investigate the situation of qualified workers with disabilities, because statistics show that most people with disabilities working in the mainstream are employed in like blue collar works, and they receive low salaries, and they are not employed in the like top positions in Japanese companies. But as the access to higher education is improving, a lot more qualified workers arrive on the job market with a disability. And so my research question for this study was to investigate whether improved access to higher education would enable people with disabilities to have better careers in Japanese companies. So that was the purpose of my study on mainstream employment. And I also conducted fieldwork on sheltered workshops. I also visited about 20 sheltered workshops, and I conducted interviews with managers and also employees and also people with disabilities working there, so as to have a broad perspective on the situation of sheltered workshops and maybe the specificities of sheltered workshops in Japan, because I think they are run in a way that is slightly different from the way it is run in France. So it was very interesting for me to see how these workshops work in Japan.
So getting back to the disabled employees responses that you collected, I was reading some sample responses, and I could see the employer patronizing attitude in there, right? Yeah, how employers were saying that, oh, I'm kind of protecting you, so maybe you cannot do this kind of job because it requires a lot of traveling, for example, right? Yeah, you won't be able to do that, and so forth. Okay, next question. Overall, what do you hope readers, particularly scholars and students of disability studies, will take away from your book? And by scholars and students of disability, I mean students and scholars of any types of disability studies, not necessarily in the United States, Japan, or France, but also all over the world.
I think when we discuss the situation of the social situation and the social treatment of people with disability, we tend to focus on inclusion, and the opposite of inclusion would be exclusion or discrimination. So there is kind of a binary opposition between inclusion and exclusion or discrimination. And so I wanted to investigate a little bit more what is in between these two sides. And I think in between there is something called paternalism, or like patronization. I think that's exactly what is taking place in Japan, because I think that in current Japanese society, it's very rare to hear people saying things that are strongly like hostile to people with disabilities. I mean, it can happen, but it's very rare. So I think the main attitude toward people with disabilities, it's not like hatred. It's not direct discrimination. It's something that is slightly more like insidious. And so I wanted to investigate this like in between situation. So I think the key issue of my book is to think outside of the inclusion exclusion opposition, and to discuss maybe things that are maybe not hostile to people with disabilities. They are not directly maybe aggressive, but still it's not like respecting the rights of people with disabilities. So that's the main perspective of my book, I would say, from the viewpoint of disability studies.
Yeah, not coming from the egalitarian standpoint. Okay, so here is my last question for you. Looking ahead, as a Japanese studies specialist and also sociologist, what research directions would you like to see explored in Japanese disability studies, either by yourself or other scholars?
Is it okay if I mention my current research project?
Sure.
So actually, when I was writing this book, I also had in mind, especially when I did the historical investigation, but it's still true in contemporary society, but I had in mind the fact that family support is extremely important for people with disabilities, and the life of a person with a disability will actually be extremely different depending on the kind of family support they can receive. So my next research interest is what happens for people with disabilities who don't have a family. And so I'm investigating the issue of children with disability in childcare institutions. So in Japanese we say shakaiteki yoiku, and we also say yogo shisetsu. So it's special institutions for children who cannot be taken care of by their own parents. So they have to be taken care of either by foster parents, but foster parents are actually very rare in Japanese society. So most of them will go to institutions where they will be raised by employees of the institutions. So they are not necessarily orphans. Most of them have a family, but the family is not capable of taking care of them. So I really wanted to investigate this subject, because when I looked at education for children with disability, I could see that family support, and especially support from the mother, was basically necessary everywhere. So it was very important for me to investigate the situation of children with disabilities who don't have a mother who is in capacity of taking care of them. So that's my current research project. And maybe more broadly speaking, I think it's very important also to link disability studies with family studies, because the role of family is very important in the life of people with disabilities, especially in the life of children with disabilities. So I think it's very important to link those two subjects to go deeper in the investigation of the situation of people with disabilities.
That's a great point. Wow, that sounds exciting. Well, good luck to your new research. And thank you very much today.